I don't know about you, but I feel a little bit like a second-class citizen stuck on the hydrocarbon Titanic, a global economic ship of state, if you will, whose captains and those in first class have very little incentive to disturb their party and veer away from the minefield heaving into view, or to deal with a gash already on the ship's side. The ship has caught on fire while also taking on water. The people in steerage are dying below decks. They've tried to put out those fires and patch over the gap, while others have warned the ship officers of that pesky minefield and gash. Fortunately, the officers in cabin class have noticed all this, but they are confident not only in their leadership, but also the ship's design. And they see no reason not to continue to enjoy the band and the canapé.
Reports in The Guardian of your comments that there is no science behind calls to cut fossil fuels. Do you maintain this, and do you accept that language like this and talk of people living in caves could contribute to a loss of public confidence in this COP outside of the negotiating bubble here on site?
And let me just clarify where I stand on the science. I hope this time it gets picked up. It needs to be orderly, fair, just, and responsible. And it needs to be well managed.
They remain determined to deal with the situation at their own pace and, of course, on their own terms. So it's not surprising their priority is to change course as little as possible and have the band play on, give or take, dabbling in a carbon capture scheme or two. All this high-level priority and policy has amounted to bugger all for most everyone. We are being fricasseed, pan-seared, or drowned. Take your pick. Or not. We get all of them. It's such a deal. Understandably, not everybody is entirely satisfied with this situation, and they voice their complaints. But the captains of the ship of state are really not all that responsive. They've got their priorities, all very lucrative ones. But I'm not going to argue against renewables and electric vehicles. They do have their place. But the transition to these technologies is very expensive, environmentally destructive, exploitative, and fraught in many ways. They do not change the fundamental expense and cost structure, ultimately the energy intensity of the global economy.
One of the most shocking discoveries that Strongtowns discovered is that the replacement cost of all of the infrastructure in Lafayette, something that you would expect to happen over about one generation, was about $32 billion. And that's just infrastructure, not all the other everyday costs needed to run a city. Yet the existing tax base was much smaller than that. In order to bridge the difference, Strongtowns calculated that the average family in Lafayette would see their tax bill go from about $1,500 per year to $9,200 per year. But the median household income in Lafayette was only $41,000 at the time. There's simply no way that can happen. But those simple averages are hiding the bigger picture of who's subsidizing who. Because these gray sections are the poorer areas, while these red areas are significantly wealthier.
One cornerstone of this very lavish and spendthrift form of economy is car-centric design, epitomized by suburban sprawl, that's come to dominate the U.S., Canada, and parts of Europe. It's been pursued in the U.S. with abandon for over 50 years, and it turns out that city zoning laws are foundational to this process. They've been structured to feed into eternally spreading sprawl. There's one little problem. It's physically unsustainable because eventually you run out of land. Either some pesky mountains get in the way, or an ocean, maybe the town next door. And that causes another problem. Suburban sprawl and car-centric design happen to be financially insolvent. Really, the studies have been done. It's basically a Ponzi scheme. So, when you run out of places to sprawl into, city finances begin to suffer. Car dependency is also very expensive individually. It costs a lot of money to purchase, store, fuel, insure, and maintain cars. And that's quite an expense to, be able to gather a quart of milk, have the kids play soccer, walk the dog, or get to work. And if for any reason you lose the capacity to actually drive yourself hither and yon, it can really turn into a desperate situation. It's not really a great environment for people to live in or work in. But further, our lifestyle and economies are the standard the rest of the world are encouraged to aspire to. It's the trapping of prosperity. And on the investment side, IMF officials, investors, banks are going to lend according to what they're comfortable with. They understand the car-centric model very well, even if they may not understand its financial insolvency.
Here's the Urban 3 map of taxable value per acre. Once again, downtown is clearly visible. And here's the 3D map of revenue compared to expenses. It's still obvious where downtown is, but you might be wondering about this little bump over here. This is Crescent Village, a modern mixed-use development, because once again, these kinds of mixed-use walkable neighborhoods financially outperform car-dependent suburbia every single time. By the way, here's what that 3D map of Eugene looks like from below. The red spikes correspond almost perfectly to modern car-centric suburban developments, a visual reminder that car-dependent suburbia is being subsidized by productive urban places. The data from Urban 3 makes the subsidies visible, and it makes it very clear who's subsidizing who. In Eugene, Urban 3 analyzed 9 categories of development: residential, mixed-use, and commercial in low, medium, and high density. And here's what the average revenue for the city looked like after taking into account the servicing of these properties. In the case of Eugene, the low-density suburban housing is being subsidized by everything else.
It might be a good idea if developing nations were never lured onto this pathway, which is breaking the bank of many cities across the U.S. In summary, the entire world has every reason to prioritize the transition to car-free villages, towns, and city neighborhoods. They save time, lives, money, and energy. And, as a standard to aspire to, it will spare nations a financial dead end they least can afford. The captains of the global hydrocarbon ship of state have naturally prioritized and fought over the transition to renewables and electric cars. They quite naturally lobby for money to invest in Hail Mary technologies like carbon capture or geoengineering. But these are all measures that minimize or redeploy their own existing business models and do very little to shift the overall energy intensity of the economy, even though these economic norms, the economic structure, are demonstrably financially and ecologically insolvent. We have every reason to aggressively pursue transition to 15-minute cities, car-free cities, whatever name you want to ascribe to them. There is absolutely no reason not to do this. And that priority starts with a remarkably inexpensive investment in the right zoning laws. This is incredibly inexpensive to pursue. And your average city council person is much more amenable to persuasion than Darren Woods or Sultan Jabbar, especially if you are armed with the financial studies that the nice people over at, say, Strong Towns can supply. That becomes far more potent when we can bring along like-minded friends and neighbors, and perhaps even some business leaders who understand the advantages of customers with more time and money to spend on their shops, and maybe even a lighter tax burden. You never know. Even better, I can guarantee the travel costs of doing so are bound to be far less expensive than a trip to Dubai. And I want to point out that there are other areas of local laws that can make a tremendous difference in the energy efficiency of our immediate surroundings. That includes building codes. Turns out,
Quaint, walk-up apartments like this one behind me are a beloved feature in cities around the world. They're inviting and full of character. But here in North America, they are not allowed to be built today. Instead, our apartments are big and imposing, often stretching across an entire block. And the reason why really comes down to one reason: staircases.
on an enormous effect on the quantity and quality and variety of housing available to us in our towns and cities. And, having plentiful housing with a lot of different choices for different economic needs is kind of a nice idea. It's one other angle to pursue if you've managed to get the car-free itch scratched.